Thank you very much. It's indeed a privilege to be with the Distinguished Ambassador on this particular platform. Let me begin at the outset by thanking Ram Madhavji, the board at India Foundation, and the MEA for this opportunity, and also compliment very effusively this initiative, which I think has to go from strength to strength. Now, in about 20 minutes or so at my disposal, my brief is actually quite onerous, because unlike many other presentations, I'm going to be talking about a region that I have to inform about, I have to in some way educate, and yet I have to offer a perspective. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly run through certain components of my presentation and try and provide certain flagging instances which will reinforce what I'm trying to say. Firstly, introducing Latin America to audiences in India. We geographically, as students in school, had studied about continents. Now, to put it very simply, Latin America for us is Latin America and the Caribbean. The ministry has a division which is called Latin America and the Caribbean division, the LAC division. So what we essentially do is we amalgamate or we collate three sub-regions. We have what we call as Central America, which is Mexico and the 6 other countries with Panama at the lower end, which is Central America. That's 7 countries. We have 13 countries on what is called as mainland South America, on the Atlantic and the Pacific. And we have Caribbean islands, which have had British, Spanish, French, Dutch, etc. So all of them put together, you're talking of a region which is 625 million and counting, 33 sovereign units, a rising middle class, rising incomes, and economies today which can be called relatively resilient. We're living in a world today where you would give an arm and a limb if you got 3, 4, 5% growth outside of India and China. Of course, for us, it would be very poor. From that standpoint, Latin America at an indexed continental level is growing at about 3.5%, and projected to grow upwards of 3.5 to 4 and 5% by 2020. Now, that's quite commendable. So this is about Latin America in brief in terms of the introduction. I'll quickly delve into a kind of chronicling of where Latin America has come from before I get into the India-Latin America situation. Now, Latin American countries became independent almost 2 centuries ago, but we'll talk about history since India became independent. In the 1940s and 50s, Latin American countries wrestled with the whole idea of the Cold War. The geopolitical theater came rousingly to them, and many of these countries alternated between democracy and between coups that proved to be interrupting. Through the 1960s, Raul Prebisch, a very famous economist who came from Latin America and who headed the Economic Commission of Latin America and Caribbean at one point in time, he had pioneered the concept of what is called as import substitution industrialization. And that caught on in Latin America as Latin American countries tried to forge some kind of economic autonomy through autarky. In the 1970s, this got a pass. In the 1980s, this was a debilitating decade for Latin America and the Caribbean. It's often called the lost decade. This was a decade during which the region underwent deep debt and even deeper and profound hyperinflation. The kind of hyperinflation figures that sometimes we hear today in the African context, we heard it in the case of Zimbabwe over the last 2-3 years, those kind of numbers we heard in the 1980s. So these economies literally had run aground. With the end of the Cold War, America retreated politically, did not do so economically. And so while this continent began to see the sweep of democratization, it wrestled with another reality. And that reality was what is called as the Washington Consensus, which came about across this region. These were neoliberal economic prescriptions, which were sold to these countries as the kind of panacea to come out of their economic gripes, economic situation. Fording through that, you also had the situation towards the end of the 1990s when the Americans tried to make a comeback in the region politically, and that happened in some ways with what happened in Venezuela. There was a coup which tried to unseat President Chavez. That was aborted. And in light of that particular coup, which in some regards was traced back to certain handiwork from up north, you had a new reality now in Latin America. That Latin America finally said, we are going to be autonomous and we are going to articulate a Latin American vision for our foreign policy. What you have seen over the last 25 years is Latin American countries have tried to emerge out of the shadows of America and have tried to forge a diversification of their foreign policies, and I'll come to that later. Now let's talk a little bit about India-Latin America relations. Obviously, our relations are about 7 decades old. Quite clearly, the early countries with whom we established relations were Brazil, Mexico, subsequently through the 50s and 60s, Cuba, because Cuba joined us in the whole non-aligned struggle. But our understanding of Latin America was extremely ideological and very narrow and parochial. So through the prism of Nehru, we saw the region as being nothing but a political backwater to Washington. So we saw it essentially as a region that is suffering from coups and essentially working under the tutelage of America. And obviously this was not a region with whom we would make common cause. Through the 90s, 60s, and 70s, we had some notional engagement with that through the framework of what is called as the UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. That was a move which led to the creation of what is called as the NIEO, which is the New International Economic Order in 1974-75. Again, we walked away from each other. Relations were quite low politically. Economically, our economies were not complementary, but our economies were quite common to one another. And that's why finding synergies was difficult. And so relationship on the economic front also remained quite low. Through the 80s, we had our socialistic moorings, they had their lost decade. So there was really no context for us to take our economic engagement to any degree of vibrancy. The real change has begun to happen since the 1990s. In 1991, trade between India and the region of Latin America and the Caribbean was about $200 million. Today, it's swelled to $45 billion. You would say fantastic. But the counter would be that this is a region of 33 countries. So across 33 countries, we are trading, and we have a kind of a regional basket of $45 billion. Even within that, the balance of trade is largely in favor of Latin America and the Caribbean, and largely Latin America, because we import a lot of strategic natural resources. So in that sense, many would say we have underachieved. In terms of investment, it's about $12 to $14 billion. This pales in significance to what China is doing in the region. So the tendency would be to say that the relationship has not achieved its potential. Now, why has it been so? And I'm going to focus on some issues. The first thing is, when India and Latin America look at each other, we have tended to look at each other through some established stereotypes. When we look at the region, we continue to believe that this region in the past and today has been oscillating between two kinds of realities. This is our stereotype, that they were under the tutelage of the Americans till about 1991, and lately they are under the tutelage of a new patron, the People's Republic of China. I think both of these understandings are extremely simplistic and superficial. I'll give you 3 instances where Latin America in the last 25 years has shown autonomy of action. In 1995, President Clinton tried to push the idea of a free trade area of the Americas, but that was shot down in the light of the experiences of the Washington Consensus by a unifying consensus within Latin America and the Caribbean. In 2002, when the Iraq resolution almost came to a vote, Resolution 1445, it did not go through because there was opposition on the council by 2 non-permanent members, namely Mexico and Chile. It's a different matter, they paid the price for it subsequently, but the point is they stood up to America on that issue. Similarly, a few years later, there was the election of the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, the regional body of the region. The Americans put up the Mexican candidate, and there was a rival candidate put up by the rest of Latin America. For the first time in the history of the OAS, an American-sponsored candidate, the Mexican Foreign Minister Ernesto Derbez, lost to Cesar Gaviria. It was a sign that Latin America can stand united and can definitely express its own self. So that's the problem with being simplistic. From the point of view of Latin America, they also have a stereotype. For them, India has largely been the land of mystique, the land of allure, and they have not been able to comprehend some of the transformative processes and changes happening in modern India. So even now when I visit the region, I either don't find a single course on India, specifically on India and the region, across their varsities, or if I find one, it is focused on 19th century, 18th century India, and does not reflect some of the deep-seated realities that India can bring to the table in a beneficent manner. So there is a lack of strategic understanding. In the year 2000, the government of India enacted a document called the Focus-LAC. This document decided to strategize for the region. And there are about 15 points that were accepted under Focus-LAC. But essentially what we did under Focus-LAC was we got into what can be called as the 5 into 5 approach, which is we essentially focused on 5 countries and we focused on 5 product lines. Quite understandable, we were wanting to grow, and this was a time of high growth rates under Prime Minister Vajpayee. So obviously we looked at strategic natural commodities. So you're looking at hydrocarbons, you're looking at copper, you're looking at gold, silver, minerals, and metals. And you're not looking much beyond that. And in terms of that, you're not looking at all countries, only looking at a few countries. So you're looking at Venezuela for hydrocarbons, Ecuador for hydrocarbons, you're looking at Chile for copper, you're looking at Peru for minerals, and you're looking at Brazil because that's obviously the biggest country. But there have been certain instances in the India relationship which I call inflection points for our relationship. The first is what happened in 2002. This was a time when the Brazilians were subsidizing the largest anti-AIDS program, and American multinational companies were fleecing them with high rates of these drugs. President Lula reached out to India and asked Prime Minister Vajpayee, if we can do a deal on this and a political deal, can Indian pharma products be exported to Brazil? And I want these drugs, and that could be a great achievement. He came to India. It was unique because it was a very important visit by Lula. The political agreement led to the fact that Lula went back and with one stroke of the pen, rescinded these agreements with American MNCs, and that was what marked the entry and the foray of Indian pharmaceutical sector into Brazil and onwards into Latin America. To the point where today, we export more pharma products to Latin America than China does. And our markets are no longer only Brazil or Mexico, they have expanded continent-wide. In 2004, India joined what is called as a UN Democracy Fund. Now, this was an idea that was launched by President Bush in 2001 when he spoke in Krakow, Poland, and he talked of a UN-led democracy fund. We joined it with the Americans, but who was the other country which was a founder? It was Chile. Now, why am I talking about Chile? This is a country between 1973 and 1990 endured one of the most stifling and oppressive regimes of Augusto Pinochet. It was emerging out of that era when a couple of decades of some of the worst crimes had happened. And yet within 14 years today, Chile was in a position where it could talk about the fact that it has moved to being a full constitutional democracy, because over the last 25 years, they have actually been able to hold periodic elections, regular elections, and been able to complete free constitutional handover of power. This is how transition of a region happens. And that puts your relationship with a country like India on a totally different platter. In 2005, we, of course, joined IPSA. IPSA was mentioned in the morning. It's a different matter that IPSA has been fledgling since 2010 because of crises in Brazil and South Africa. I could refer to that in Q&A. We also joined BRICS. So obviously, our relationship with Brazil became the centerpiece of our strategy. But I do believe that while our relationship with Brazil is important and must be coveted, where we have erred is we have almost put all our eggs into the Brazilian basket. And this is one of the problems in Indian foreign policy. I'm not going to pinpoint who is to blame. The point is we have often obsessed with one country in one region, and we have devoted extra political capital to the point where we have not been able to extract the requisite economic incentive, which Mr. Prabhu mentioned in the morning by giving the example of Cuba. And I'll give you some examples. There's no doubt Brazil has helped us at different points in time. When the IAEA waiver was down to the wire in Vienna, it was Brazil who was in the chair. And if you're in the chair, you can shape the agenda, at least in terms of what happens in the meeting. In 2010, when President Obama came to India and he spoke about India's credentials of being a permanent member of the Security Council, he spoke eloquently about India's credentials, singling out India at that stage, which is understandable. He was speaking in India. The reaction of the other 3 foreign offices, Germany, Japan, and Brazil, is instructive. Both Germany and Japan, strong relationships of India, they reacted by saying President Obama should not have singled out India, he should have spoken of the G4. It was Brazil who gave the most constructive response, saying, we know it's the G4, but we understand why India has been talked about exclusively. Thereby saying that within the G4 as well, India stands as a very unique country. So there has been constructive engagement on that side. But what have we done? As a result of overdoing Brazil, we have realized that Brazil cannot be your gateway. It's the only Portuguese-speaking country in a largely Spanish-speaking continent. Secondly, there's no confrontation on the continent, but there's a deep-seated competitiveness on the continent. So when you overdo the relationship with Brazil and you understate or underwhelm the relationship with other countries, the Pacific Alliance countries, which I'll come to, you are actually signaling that your policy is lopsided and skewed. So what has been happening lately? There's no doubt that till about 2010, the relationship has floundered. But I believe there is reason for it to change. And with that, I will stop in the next maybe 2 or 3 minutes. If there is any government, I think it's this government which can reshape the calculus of our engagement with the region. And why do I say so? You have a strategic appreciation of this region at the very top, and that matters. And let me give an example. Prime Minister Modi, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he engaged Latin American and Caribbean High Commissioners not once but twice in formal settings at Gujarat Bhavan. And the JS-LAC who participated in that time has told me first-hand information, they came away impressed. He came to them prepared with dossiers on every country in the region that he was meeting, every high commissioner and every ambassador he was meeting. And he even told them that you will participate in the next Vibrant Gujarat Summit, and I will organize a separate pavilion for Latin American and Caribbean high commissioners and ambassadors. Now, this coming from an Indian prime minister to an entire continent was refreshing and salutary for these people. Secondly, you contrast this with what happened in 2012 when President Christina Kirchner was coming to India. She was coming at a time when there was a certain dispute with China. Argentina sells a lot of soy oil and edible oil to China, and China picks up a lot of it. China played hardball with them and told them we're not going to buy it this year, hoping that the prices would crash. Argentina had surplus stocks. They didn't know where to go. So they obviously reached out to India. Sharad Pawar, the minister concerned, showed proactivity. We picked up a lot of the soy oil. Argentina from that day said, you will be our first country, you will have the right of first refusal. She was coming in the backdrop of this. And the then Prime Minister was being briefed by JS-LAC. A distinguished economist was being told about his meeting that was going to happen with the visiting Argentine president. And after hearing in a muffled tone, he says, yeah, I know all these things, but Argentina is equal to sovereign default. This is contrast in terms of strategic appreciation. So where do we stand today? We can talk in terms of trade flows, investment flows, we can talk of all this. This is important. But today's Indian foreign policy is truly a global foreign policy. And in the words of Prime Minister Modi, it means no country left behind. This is the missive he gave all diplomats and cabinet ministers, that by the end of the first term, we have to ensure that every member with whom we have diplomatic relations, there must be a ministerial visit to that particular country. In his words, that's what is a global foreign policy. Now, which means we will have to appreciate the region for what the region does. For instance, Indian soft power, Sri Ravi Shankar. In 2010, when he had gone to Buenos Aires, he organized Sudarshan Kriya. 5,000 Argentines in the heart of Buenos Aires congregating and doing it. Is it not soft power? Are we following up on it? Subsequently, he was instrumental in the mediation with FARC in Colombia. Those who were there for the Indian Ocean Conference in Singapore would have seen that before he addressed, there was a small video that was played, in which the Colombian president himself acknowledged the work of Sri Ravi Shankar. What have we done to take this forward? I know for a fact that Ayurvedic products has a big market in Latin America. Some studies have estimated it to be up to $500 million. And I had an experience just 10 days ago when Pro-Colombia, which is the commercial arm of the Colombian government, reached out to me and asked me, do you know somebody senior within Patanjali? We want to actually reach out to them and tell them that these are countries you can actually showcase your products to. Is this not soft power? This is soft power, but this is soft power coupled with a business proposition. It can't get better economics and better business sense than this. In the morning, Mr. Prabhu spoke about how water surfeit the region is. We are water stressed, they are water resplendent. And one can see that. These are countries with large land masses. These are countries with small populations. They have huge grasslands. They have water availability. These are the most propitious regions of the world, which can be very low-hanging fruits for Indian agri-processing businesses to not just go there and make money, but from there to be able to source third markets. Because growing Indian economy is not only about being able to sell your wares, is also about growing the footprint and the heft of India Inc. Energy security. I just heard this morning, and I was very happy from our Venezuelan friends, the ambassador is here, the counselor is here, the first secretary, that Prime Minister Modi has extended the invite for the International Solar Alliance to His Excellency President Maduro. And this goes with the fact that Latin American countries have been in the forefront of not just being able to tap into conventional energy, which comes from hydrocarbons, but to be at the cusp or the inflection point of being able to deliver on renewable energy. Whether it's Paraguay with hydropower, whether it's Chile, who's doing fantastically when it comes to solar and renewable energy, these are areas where India and Latin America can find convergence over values and convergence over governance principles. Cultural tourism. I'm talking about signature campaigns which Prime Minister Modi believes in. So I'm really talking down the road of what is priority for this government. Cultural tourism. He's talked ad nauseum about cultural tourism. In Latin America, you have Machu Picchu, for instance. If the Prime Minister visits, he could definitely visit Machu Picchu, where International Yoga Day was celebrated. But how often does it get covered in the Indian press? Yes, when yoga is done at Davos, atop the hill, it should be covered. It's a moment of great pride for an Indian. But when are we going to cover that Machu Picchu also had thousands of people sitting there and performing yoga? How will Latin America resonate if our media doesn't play ball? And when I mean media, even state media. I don't expect private media to do it. What other issues are there? And I'll just have a couple and I'll stop with that. We all know Manrega, 2005. Whose brainchild was Manrega? Of course, it was the brainchild in India, but what was the pitch that was there for it? In 2004, in fact, 2005, in the beginning of 2005, the Congress party sent a delegation under the chairmanship of Sheila Dikshit. It went to Brazil. It went to Brazil to study Bolsa Familia. Bolsa Familia has been a very, very powerful program that President Lula, when he was in governance, enacted over his 8-year tenure. And that led to significant denudation in terms of school dropouts. It was one of the first financial and social inclusion measures adopted, so much so that the UN in 2005 declared it to be a pioneering program in the developing world. That in many ways became the lead for Manrega. Cooperation. How many of us know much about it? So when we talk only about buying resources and selling resources, this is real strategic cooperation. The way we have learned this from them, we can offer our technological innovations which are frugal and also pioneering in the field of financial and social inclusion to other Latin American countries, which can help them also become better countries. Lastly, I will stop with only one point, that when we look at India and Latin America, we must remember, take cue from what China does. There's no need to necessarily feel upset if there's something to be appreciated with China. They do it for vested interest, no doubt, but they know how to cultivate a region. Latin American countries have not seen a prime ministerial visit outside of Brazil and Mexico, which is of course 4 hours, by an Indian prime minister since 1968. It's been 50 long years when Indira Gandhi last embarked on a 12-day, 8-nation jaunt in 1968. Narasimha Rao went for the Earth Summit, which was a multilateral summit, to Rio in 92. Subsequently, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh went to Brazil for BRICS in 2005. Subsequent to BRICS again in 2009. Prime Minister Modi went again for BRICS only to Brazil 2014. In 2012, you had Manmohan Singh going to Mexico for the G20. So what you can see is there has not been a visible prime ministerial visit to the region. You compare that with what the president of China does. In his first 5-year term, which ends in March, he has visited Latin America 3 times, each time doing 3 countries at a time. He's done 9 countries himself. Premier Li Keqiang has been to the region every alternate year. Zhang Dejiang, who was NPC head, has been to the region there. Chang Gao Li was in the region there. They have divided countries amongst their leaders, the kind of thing that we have started doing in Africa, where you have presidential visits, your vice presidential visits, your prime ministerial visits. But let's accept one point, and before I close, no harm to any constitutional authority, but we know how powerful a prime ministerial visit can be in the current context. I sincerely hope that Prime Minister Modi, who has been quite adept at not only breaking the molds in our foreign policy, but also breaking the hiatuses in our foreign policy. First to Australia in 28 years, first to UAE in 34 years. I hope he'll be the first prime minister to visit a set of Latin American countries and will be the first in 50 years. Thank you.